All right, good. Good morning, everyone. We are on 6:30, so I think let's officially start. And I thought the way we could officially start, Wayne, I'm going to spotlight you for a moment. Wayne is the venue lead at Cresta TGIF and a friend of Amber's, and we thought there would be no better person to introduce Amber, and then we'll move straight on. Wayne, good morning. Floor is yours.
Yeah, morning, Torsten. Morning, Amber and everyone.
Hello.
Lovely to be here this morning. It's my first one. I didn't join next week, and I have some family members that'll join with me this morning. So I'll turn off my screen so that they can join in jammies. If that's okay. So yeah, I'm very excited that Amber is doing this talk for us. Amber has been a regular with her family at the Cresta venue. And she's an old friend. I think I've known Amber from when she was studying psychology at Wits, but that's another long story. But yeah, just to say that Amber is a counseling psychologist. She's a mother. She has 3 lovely kids, one of these RT nerd geniuses as a husband. Yeah, and just to say that Amber's one of those people that I had wanted to do talks at TGIF possibly nearly a year now. So as she'd been coming, I'd been begging her to do some talks. And I think the most important thing is that I'm really excited that now the bug has bitten, because the talk that I wanted her to do is still about 2 talks away. And as she's obviously engaged with the Cresta venue and the Hodges Craig Hall venue, yeah, as I suspected, she's been very well received. I find her incredibly intelligent, insightful, and her views are very helpful. So I think for a topic like this, I think it's the perfect timing. And yeah, looking forward to hear her thoughts on that. So again, Amber, thank you very much. And over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Wayne. And good morning, everybody. It feels surreal, doesn't it? First morning of lockdown. And, you know, when I prepared this topic last week, things had rapidly changed from the week prior, but lockdown hadn't been announced yet. And I think if it had already been announced, I might have changed the topic slightly. So I'm not sticking to brief, Thorsten. I hope that's fine.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And I feel so unqualified to speak on this simply because there is so much information that I'm sure you have all mined and researched and thought through. And that's why it would be great if this could be interactive. I'm not wearing my glasses, so I'm going to lean forward every time I look at the hand up. John's hand up is up still. Is that for a reason? No. So if I lean forward, it's not because I'm being creepy or making an extra big point. It's just because I'm trying to see my screen. Yeah, so it was quite difficult to prepare for today in terms of finding an angle on this that could feel enriching or meaningful or cover terrain that all of you haven't already thought of before. I think we've all become information-seeking geniuses and have found ways to mine information on the internet that we didn't even know existed. So all I'm really going to do in this next 40 minutes or so is talk about my therapies and the issues that have emerged most prevalently over the last 2 weeks, because I think it's a good indication of what people are going through, the kind of difficulties that people are trying to process, the kind of complexities we're trying to hold, and let's hope something comes out of that that's helpful. You know, we're sitting here watching this pandemic. I don't know if this is accurate. I think I saw yesterday the figure that said something like 3 billion people are in lockdown at the moment. Has anyone else seen that figure? Is it possible? Can I ask questions like that, Thorsten, or is it going to be distracting? Do people need
you can try. We just we need to remember then to unmute ourselves to answer. But let's try it. If you it's dead on the other side.
Yeah. I think that's pretty accurate. I've heard figures between 1 billion and 3 billion. So yeah.
So the one thing we do know is that we're not alone. We're sitting here in I mean, really, that's almost not quite a third of the population, but it is an enormous amount of the population. Oh, come on, my maths brain isn't working so early in the morning. It's over a third. But I think what we're dealing with here is two pandemics. The one is a biological pandemic of COVID-19. And the one that I'm seeing most in my therapy room is a pandemic of fear and anxiety. That this is new terrain. It's absolutely uncharted territory. And although human beings have been through incredibly difficult times in the past, I think my generation, my parents' generation, my children's generation, we've never seen something like this on a global scale. Not since World War II have we had to find the resilience to try and calibrate. And this happened so quickly, didn't it? We all knew that, I mean, I heard it coming like we all did in December and started noticing the news reports increasingly focusing on Wuhan and wondering, I suppose, why it was such a big deal, not having the foresight to realize that this was coming at us like a speeding train. So it has come at us fast. As a world, it's been since December, early January. And I think as it's come closer and closer, so the fears come closer and closer. I think that the fears are multiple. On a most basic level, we're afraid of dying. And I've had to make a decision to not read reviews, too many reviews or stories from people who describe the loneliness and the helplessness of those kind of contexts when the medical system's overwhelmed. I think that fear, and if we allow ourselves to go there in our heads, is almost too much for us to imagine. We fear chaos, particularly in this country. We fear disruption. And I think as human beings, we fear loss. And this is all about loss, isn't it? It's about the loss that we're all facing every day, the loss of our freedoms, the loss of our constitutional rights, the fear of the loss of the people that we love so much. People in school and university, kids that have just started at varsity in first year, we sent them off so excitedly in Feb, and now they've bounced back. I think anybody who's in transition, in a difficult stage in their primary relationship, families where there's not peace and harmony, like ours. People who are getting married, matric students who are totally disrupted. And those are the first world problems, They're the losses we're all dealing with. And it's been interesting for me, as I'm sure it has been interesting for you guys, to watch everyone's reaction, to watch the media reaction, and to watch the different discourses that are happening out there. And I've tried to identify a few of them. I think it's always interesting to see what makes up the grand narrative. And of course, there is, initially when things were far away, there was that sort of evolutionary narrative of the sort of people who have been trying to be factual and pragmatic and think about this conceptually would say, it's a culling. The world's population is too big. It's just a culling. And there's that sort of strand, and we all look at that with horror and dismay and go, how can so much inhumanity live in that discourse? But nevertheless, that discourse is there. There is the environmental discourse, and I'm sure we've all seen. It actually broke my heart because I was so excited, first of all, when I saw the dolphins swimming in the Venice canals, and then we found out that was fake news. And the research says that actually believing something and then finding out that it's fake is far worse than never believing it in the first place. But there is quite a strong environmentalist discourse saying Mother Nature sent us to Earth, sent us to our rooms to tell us we need to think about what we've done. Then there's the economic discourse. The fact that, the very valid fact that the idea that a pandemic like this can happen is a consequence of inequality. It's the ultimate outplay of the Gini coefficient that we've got in the world. And if there was good on par healthcare everywhere, this wouldn't have happened. Sadly, there is, in extreme cases, the religious discourse, God's judgment. It's Sodom and Gomorrah once again. That comes from some corners. There's a political discourse that says this is all about destabilizing what is unequal anyway. And then there's the personal discourse, and this is the one, of course, that I'm most interested in, because it's the discourse of othering. You know, when it was over in China, it felt very far away. And it's really hard for us to hold the idea that bad stuff is coming at us. And we, as human beings, tend to do distancing. We tend to, I'm sure you all do it, when you hear a terribly sad story, a tragic death, one of the first questions we think, even though we might be too sensitive to ask, is, so how old was the person? Oh, did they have any underlying health conditions? Oh, and did they smoke? You know, these questions in our mind, because we want to do anything to differentiate that from us. I mean, we see it very loudly displayed with Donald Trump insisting on calling this the Chinese virus. I think it's a political strategy apart from anything else, but it's just a distancing from things that we don't know. Well, I found it even in myself, when the first cases arrived in South Africa, my first thought was, oh, you know, these travelers. Now, I'm a traveler, I love traveling. But it was that sense of they've traveled, so therefore they're vulnerable and susceptible. And I think that dynamic is not unique to me or the people I've spoken to, and it's going to sit quite heavily in the South African context, where there could be a discourse that privileged people have traveled and brought this pandemic here. We look at people's weight, we look at whether they're diabetic or not. All of those things are sort of these very little self-soothing mechanisms we use to try and make ourselves feel less vulnerable. I think some added dynamics here is that this is very intellectually confusing. And I think we have all watched the noise on social media around initially everyone making fun of the overreactors, and then the overreactors judging the underreactors and trying to sort of get a sense of where reality sits. And I have to say, I have been, like most of us, so proud of our government, and proudly South African moments have abounded when we've seen our president step into this leadership role, because I think he's really served us this wonderful gift of being able to move away from that confusion and to be able to just adhere to party line. And for him to come out with such a clear clarion call has taken away a lot of those debates that might have really degenerated in a very polarizing way. You know, those that are disdainful of the hype and those that are very anxious and cautious. So I'm very grateful for that, and I think it's put our country into a place of a lot of unity. I think another added dynamic with this, and it's so different to crises that human beings have experienced before, is that this is quite a cruel, it contains quite a cruel paradox, that going through such anxiety-provoking contexts like this, our inclination as human beings is to draw together. And in fact, we get soothed through social engagement. And being a historical fiction fan, I've read so many books around the world wars where people went down to the bunkers and there was a sense of camaraderie and togetherness and people volunteering and a real sense of a community drawing together. And this virus is separating us, it's isolating us, it's taking us into our homes, it's separating us from within our family. It's separating us from our friends and from our communities and from our churches. And it's so counterintuitive. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to put that in now as just a part of the dynamics that we're dealing with. My feeling as a counseling psychologist, and I know that you guys will see this, is that I think we need to be really careful to stop a biological pandemic from becoming a mental health pandemic. And if we're able to separate out those two, we deal with the virus in the way that the virus needs to be dealt with, but we deal with our mental health issues in a very informed way. We've got more information about that. We know how to prevent ourselves from being vulnerable. We know how to take preventative action. We know how to treat anxiety and depression in anticipation. There's robust protocol around it. So what I want to talk a bit about is those interventions, simply because that's all I really have to offer. I can't say anything more about the virus. There's an interesting dynamic around what happens to our bodies when we're anxious. I would love, if I could see a show of hands, and I don't think I'll be able to, but I would love to know how many of you have found yourself in physiological hyperarousal in the last 2 weeks. You know, that sense that you either sort of just lose your appetite, or maybe all you're craving is sugar. There's almost a slight buzzy feeling in your body. I've 1,000 times thought, oh my goodness, is this anxiety or is it COVID? There is a feeling of agitation. I don't think a lot of people are sleeping well. Oh, good, I see some hands there. Yeah. There's this feeling, I felt the need after all of my sessions at the end of the day, just as though I've carried the weight of all of my clients' anxiety on me, and I've needed to walk, and which I do anyway, I love it. But as I've walked, I felt like I've needed to release that adrenaline that's built up in my system. It's going to be interesting now that we're all locked down, and has been increasingly difficult to do that anyway. But the idea is that when we're anxious and when we're faced with a threat that feels as though it's endangering us or our way of life, we know that adrenaline gets released in the body. And that adrenaline is perfectly appropriate. It's a brilliant human design. When the saber-toothed tiger was lunging for us, our adrenaline released in our bodies, and it gave us this capacity to exit the challenging situation. So yay, all kudos to adrenaline. It's got a fantastic role to play. However, when we're unable to execute an appropriate action, when we can't leap on that saber-toothed tiger and kill it, or run away from it, or do what we need to do, that adrenaline stays unresolved. It sits burning in our body, and it's not diffusing. And what that happens, not to get too technical on you, but when that happens, our cortisol is what regulates our adrenaline. And cortisol also regulates our hormones. It also regulates our circadian rhythm. And it regulates some of our digestive functions. So when cortisol is sort of reallocated and redeployed, and it's now attending almost completely to regulating our adrenaline, our adrenal output, a lot of those other functions go neglected. So we find our bodies being disrupted and put in a place of hyperarousal that we can't come down from. And that's where typically you find that experience over a long period of time is what results in burnout, anxiety, sustained anxiety disorders, and ultimately it can lead to depression. The way human beings usually find a way out of that when we can't go to war or we can't run away is that we co-regulate. So what we do is we find a way to engage with other people. And in that process of being able to watch someone, which is why video calls are so valuable in this time of isolation, when we're able to watch someone, read their visual cues, listen to the auditory tone, the intonation, when we're able to do that, our body almost synchronizes with another human being. And it serves the purpose of allowing our physiologies to co-regulate, and that then brings down our adrenaline, which is a wonderful gift. Really tricky when you're socially isolating. Those of us who are lucky enough to be locked down with family members, that's an incredible gift. It's not always enough though. We need our peer connections. We need those conversations that aren't just in a very domesticated realm to help us to co-regulate all the different parts of us. It's interesting, I read the other day that quite far into our evolutionary processes, human beings developed the capacity to write and use symbols to communicate. And so, although emailing and texting and using WhatsApp does go some way towards helping us to co-regulate, it's really the visual and the auditory that does it. That's the primal part of us. And when we experience connection with another human being in those ways, our adrenal system, our primal system gets soothed. Okay, I've got a very brief bit here about self-care, just because when we're anxious, self-care often can go out the door. I said earlier that people often lose their appetites or start eating the wrong thing. I think this is key to whether you're hungry or not, you eat. Whether you're craving the wrong things or not, you first eat the right things and then eat the wrong things. We need to take care of our bodies in this time. We need to sleep and do all of the things that we need to do to sleep. I personally find I can't go near the screen at the moment after hours because it disrupts my sleep. Showering and washing our hair, all of the stuff you know, but actually in lockdown, I mean, here I am sitting with pajama bottoms on. I don't know how many of you guys are, but attending, it'll be very easy for me now that I'm doing online sessions to just get dressed from the waist up. I'm still trying to figure out if that's a good or bad thing. Routine, I think, is going to be hugely important, and taking one day at a time. And to hold the faith. I keep on thinking human beings have been designed divinely with a capacity to deal with difficult stuff. Difficult things, it's not unique to what's happening to us. I think that we're just a little bit rusty in terms of deploying those muscles on an international base, with an international crisis.
Right on, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, I think you're right on, Amber. Great point.
Yeah.
This is Fred. Sorry. Thank you so much.
No, thanks for that. Yeah, and please feel free to, it's quite weird. I don't know if any of you have been watching the Trevor Noah show now that he doesn't have an audience. Suddenly I feel like I relate to him. It's quite strange to chat and not get feedback, but I'm hoping that you're all there and not going back to sleep. There was something very briefly I wanted to touch on, and I addressed it in the ad, as it were, for this talk, which was, I think it's useful at this point to recognize our own defenses, because when we get recruited by our defenses, we land up spiraling further into anxiety. It's quite an irony, actually, that when we're anxious, we go to our defense. When we engage with our defense, we're almost reifying to our body that the anxiety is legitimate. So the more we engage with the defense, the greater the anxiety builds. And I've used these, they're sort of lay terms, but I think that they're quite nice to look at, because sometimes we think it's our intellectualizing, or we think that it's just our take on it that gives us a particular insight, and actually it's our defense playing out. So I'm going to go through those 5 very easy and primal defenses. The first one is the fight. And I think in this context, it's been interesting to see the barneys that have been happening on social media. The judginess, oh my word. It's quite astonishing. The blaming and, I don't have an opinion about people who are stocking up on toilet paper. Of course, we need to be responsible. But I also have so much compassion for people who are caught up in this terrible anxiety around not having loo paper. And so they buy a whole lot. But then the judginess that comes with that. Now that is the fight defense. And if you're finding yourself very reactive in terms of finding what people are doing appalling, it's possible that you're engaging with the fight defense. I see it. I mean, I drove out yesterday to go and get dog food, and like many other people, saw that lockdown was not happening for everyone yet, and clearly hadn't been for a while. And I had this incredible judgment in my heart around, do they not care about protecting the vulnerable, and why aren't they taking this seriously? And it's just so easy to get recruited by that discourse. The sun's coming. Just let me, if the light changes too much, let me know and I can close the window. Someone, Thorsten, you'll do that, eh? So recognize that fight response in you. And it's even happened within family groups where, someone in the family, and I'm talking specifically about WhatsApp groups, starts dissing another for either over or underreacting. I think it's important to just stay tuned into that feeling inside. The flight response in this, oh my goodness, it has been so interesting to see. So flight is when you want to exit the difficult situation. And the way I've seen that most actively play out is people going into denial and downplaying it and minimizing it. And certainly it's what we're seeing in America and what we saw in the UK initially, where the reality of this is just too hard to contemplate. So the reaction is to counteract the experts, suddenly become an epidemiologist ourselves and decide that the risk is lower. So denial is very much part of the flight response. And another one of, I'm just going to close this blind because the sun's pouring in.
No problem, Amber. By the way, you guys have no idea what Amber's going through, to sort of speak when everybody's muted and you don't have any background noise, no feedback. You sort of feel like you're speaking to a wall. It's very difficult to do this. Thank you, Amber.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Now I'm a bit dark, but anyway, hopefully you can all still see. So one of the interesting flight responses that I've seen, and it was shocking actually to see my own response to it. Someone shared a WhatsApp video with beautiful music and scenery, and someone in this lyrical voice reading out, "Thank you, coronavirus. Thank you for teaching us that we need to connect. Thank you, coronavirus, for saving the environment." Oh, guys, thanks. I'm seeing a little encouragement there on the chats. And as I saw that video, my insides recoiled. I just felt that is just too soon. We can't start, we haven't even borne the brunt of this yet. And for people to be going, in psychological terms, we call it fast tracking to health, where you can't hold the pain. So you actually just minimize it and already leapfrog ahead to when things are okay again, or find a way to make it okay again. So interesting to recognize that in yourselves. When you go into denial or fast track to health, that's the flight response. The fawn response, I don't think, is playing out too much here. The fawn response is when you try and ingratiate yourself and do everything you can to make people like you. And I think in a time of social isolation, that's a bit tricky. And the second to last response, where I imagine most people go to, is the finding response. Now, finding is seeking. It's seeking information. It is perseverating, which means no information is ever enough. It's scrolling through your feeds on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. I don't know how big this is on Instagram. I'm not there much, but it's this fantasy that there's going to be this little bit of this nugget of information that's going to be enough to soothe your anxiety. And when you find yourself getting caught up in that information scroll, maybe just notice it and maybe just answer that anxiety in yourself by saying, you know what, I'm not going to find a solution here. I'm not going to find any information that's going to make this feel better. So finders find information and they also find solutions. So finders would have been the people out there making plans 2 weeks ago to transition to home work, to buy 1 tin extra at a time so as to not overburden the shops but still have a little bit of a stockpile in case of quarantine. Finders want to find solutions. And again, now that lockdown's happened, I think that strategy is going to be curtailed. But we need to, someone's saying I'm definitely a finder. I recognize that in myself so much. I have this incredible hunger for information, and I've learned to grow a little suspicious of it, to be honest. And then the last little F in that fancy 5F acronym is the freeze response. And I suppose the freeze response is what we really don't want to get to. You'll notice the other 4 responses are very active, and they sit in the sort of middle part of our vagal nerve system. Nolene, if you're there, you'll know exactly what I'm referring to. The freeze response is a much more primitive response, and it's really the response that animals do when they play dead. When they are, someone's saying there, why am I so suspicious of the find response? I'm not suspicious. I'll talk just now about why it's important to recognize these responses and curtail them. So with the freeze response, it's when animals roll over and play dead. And when they play dead, physiologically, their heartbeat slows. the experience of physiological mimicry of death is very real. It doesn't just sit in pretense. The whole body almost closes down. And with a major depressive episode, that incapacity to get out of bed, to move, to eat, to have any agency whatsoever, that's what depression is all about. It's going into this profound freeze response. And that's really what we're wanting to avoid. Now, that question just now, why am I suspicious of the find response? The truth is that the fight, flight, fawn, and find responses are all reactive responses. They're anxious responses that are activated into behavior change. Now, the reality is we can't actually do much. Those responses are not going to actively minimize our risk. But when we engage in them, it's almost like getting on a hamster wheel. And you get on the hamster wheel, and the more you seek that information finding, and I'm not suggesting we stay ignorant. I'm a big fan of getting access to informative, verified, non-fake news articles. But for me personally, I've had to limit it. So I've got an hour a day that I allow myself to look for information, and I've got to cap it at that. Because the more we get recruited by our defensive choice, the faster and faster that hamster wheel goes, and ultimately that's not sustainable. Ultimately, we are at danger of lapsing into depression. And really that's what we're wanting to just be cognizant of, to protect ourselves, to protect the mental health that we're holding and the mental health of the people around us, that we don't get recruited by those defenses that are just going to amplify the anxiety. So by all means, yes, we can engage with them. I mean, I like to sort of try and vary my responses so that, maybe I'll get a little judgy here, do a little information finding there, just to not get solely recruited by one, which can start to burn. And that feeling in our bodies, that feeling of slight buzzing and slight hyperarousal, it can feel like a slow burn. What I'm really suggesting is we pay attention to that, and that we find other ways apart from our defenses to manage the anxiety. So there's an acronym that's been doing the rounds that I think is useful. Am I going too fast? I'm just conscious of the time, and okay, I'm good. How do you deal with freeze? Sure. I think the way we deal with freeze, it depends how serious that freeze is. If the freeze has got to a place where it really feels extremely damaging and it feels dangerous personally, then it really is the time to contact your GP if you need to look at getting something to treat that anxiety or even the depression, or find help. SADAG, the South African Anxiety and Depression Group, has got open lines throughout this time. Help Lifeline is working throughout. There are so many health call centers for people that need it. I just want to see what that is. Is freeze also to pretend everything is okay? No, I think pretending everything okay is more around denial. So that's more the flight. It's that minimizing, and I'm not going to look at this, everything's fine. That's more of an active state. The freeze is where the brain even stops working. There's just a shutdown. Whereas denial is still an active cognitive process. So this acronym MEGA has been doing the rounds. The M stands for mindfulness practice, contemplative prayer, a time of setting aside a time. I'm just conscious of the light there. Setting aside a time to really allow your physiological hyperarousal to come down. There are so many good apps that are free. I'm going to name some of them just in case you don't know them. There's Headspace. There's Calm. There's an app called Insight Timer. There is an app called Stop, Breathe, Think. These are really worthwhile putting on your phone. And, the idea of mindfulness practice can be quite exhausting when you're feeling resourceless. So plugging into an app and letting yourself be guided through it is just the lazy person's way of doing it. I think it's great. but it does the same trick in terms of bringing down your hyperarousal. So mindfulness practice is number one. Number two is try and find a way to exercise, which I think is going to be tricky with this lockdown. But what about Christian mindfulness? Absolutely. Contemplative prayer is mindfulness. And for me, mindfulness is a spiritual practice. However you want to find expression of that. Yeah. So exercise, I've needed it to burn off that adrenaline, and after a bit of, I just walk and I find myself actually buzzing at a much lower level after that. The G stands for gratitude. Now, I mean, I find this a challenging one, and if anyone's got any ideas in the question and answer session, I'd really love to hear from you, because my experience of gratitude at the moment is that I'll think, oh, thank goodness I've got a garden. I'm so lucky. And then instantly the thought follows of all of the people that don't. And I find that about whatever I'm grateful for, there's a sting in the tail of it of I suppose, incredible compassion for those that are suffering without what I'm being grateful for. So I don't quite have an answer for that one. But on the other hand, we can all be grateful for a sunrise, and we can all be grateful for love, and we can all be grateful for strong leadership shown by our government, and we can be grateful for the scientists that are pursuing a vaccine for this. So that's sort of the way I found a way out of that conundrum, but I would love to hear anyone else when we chat just now. And then the last one, the A, stands for achievement. And really what they mean by that is, particularly in a time of lockdown, even getting out of bed is going to be an achievement. I don't think now is the time to set yourself goals of learning Spanish, playing the piano, sorting out every cupboard in your house. If those things happen, that is fantastic. And we probably will see some of that happening. But to set it out as a goal in a time where things are feeling fraught and anxiety is high may just set us up for failure. So set the bar low with achievement. That's my advice. And then whatever you manage to achieve over and above that is great. But it's useful at the end of the day, instead of having this desolate sense of loss and waste, to be able to go, well, I wrote that one email, or I connected with that one friend. Obviously, if you have animals, I think like way, way ahead. Being able to connect with these little furry creatures is soul-soothing and wonderful for us. I think set up some kind of routine. It's certainly what we're going to have a lockdown meeting in my family, with my family today, and we're going to discuss how it's going to work and having some form of schedule. I really would suggest to everyone to really limit your news exposure. And I know I said that again just now, but it doesn't go away. Just imagine that every bit of anxiety you're putting in your body is not getting a chance to diffuse at the moment. So maybe just watch that. And to shift your expectations. I know almost so many people are able to move to work from home now, and we can have expectations of business as usual, and it really isn't business as usual. I think being able to let go of the things that aren't actually that important and concentrate on what we can value most, and also the things that are inside of our control, is going to be important here. And then I've just got one more thing to say, that I think as a human race, our way through this is to find some way to transcend. And I always refer to Mary Mahoney, my mother-in-law, with this particular aspect, where she spoke to me once about how if someone is unable to help another person, it is the most debilitating place to be. And I think in lockdown, it's really easy, or it's a very vulnerable place for that, of feeling powerless, particularly those who are over 70, who've been told to quarantine at home and not venture out at all, and they're at the mercy of family to bring groceries and medicine. And there can be such a paralyzing feeling of nonness, of non-existing, of non-helpfulness. And my sense is that we can all do something to transcend, to give to another. And I've been thinking in my fantasy mind, I've been imagining grandparents all over the world doing video calls with their grandchildren who are sitting at home with frazzled parents trying to work and deal with homeschooling and deal with all of the losses and are totally overwhelmed. And actually a wonderful, wonderful time for grandparents to be more involved than ever before in being able to say, I'm going to do story time from 11 to 12. Or let me sit and do your maths homework with you. There is incredible capacity because of our interconnectivity virtually for profound use will be engaged in. I think that now is a time actually more than ever before. Oh, my internet connection is unstable. I hope that doesn't interfere. Now is the time more than ever before for grandparents to step into a place of their own, because the middle generation is holding a lot. Yeah. I think I want to actually close off with what I want to say now. And I want to read you a poem written by an Irish poet called John O'Donoghue. He's just written it, and I'm going to read it, and I'm going to read it quite slowly because I think it's so beautiful. This is how it goes. This is the time to be slow. Lie low to the wall until the bitter weather passes. Try as best as you can not to let the wire brush of doubt scrape from your heart all sense of yourself and your hesitant light. If you remain generous, time will come good, and you will find your feet again on fresh pastures of promise, where the air will be kind and blushed with beginning. I can't see any hands
Sorry,
raised.
Amber, it's John here.
Yes, hi John.
I just thought it would really be good in your point of gratitude to slow down and really think about why we're thankful. And in my context, give thanks to the Lord for what he's done, simply because we do tend to jump from one issue to the other. And our mind is buzzing at the moment. Our minds are buzzing at the moment, thinking about the next thing to do. And sitting down and just being grateful to the Lord for the things that he's done for us could prevent us from rushing to the next thing or looking at the next newspaper article, as you say, or going into freeze mode. And just for a moment, recognizing how the Lord, even through disaster and tragedy, brings glory to himself and allows us to find our solace and our peace in him.
Yeah. Thanks for that, John. I think we'll all say amen to that.
Okay, two hands, Amber.
So I see Pepe's number 1 and then Wayne.
Hi, Amber. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely so valuable. For me, a question that I have, or just a concern that I have, you mentioned the fight right at the beginning. And I was I'm actually getting emotional because I was so guilty of this on our parkrun volunteers group, that I was criticizing the fact that people were complaining so much about not being able to go out and run and walk their dogs when other people can't even get access to healthcare and to food. And then I was lambasted for my criticism of that, and then I felt guilty. So it's been quite an emotional couple of days for me on that particular topic. And I don't know what, I haven't apologized. But yeah, should I apologize or should I just let it go? Oh,
man. Oh, Pepe, you and all of us, I have to tell you, you and all of humanity, I just want to say to you that there is so much room for self-compassion here. None of the defenses are pretty. Truly, they bring out, they don't look great, but they are coming out of a place of incredible anxiety. And the people that lambasted you are coming out of their own defenses. It takes it out of an interpersonal space. And I often say when I work with couples, it's like if you visited France and Germany at the time of war, you would not see the pretty and the best. You see all of this artificial stuff that is just there to try and make those countries safer. And your response in that place was absolutely you dealing with this incredible anxiety of what vulnerable people in this country are sitting with. And that anxiety was overwhelming for you, and it came out in the way that it did, just in the way that the responses to own anxiety about what was being taken away from them and the losses that they were having to hold. So, I think more than ever, all of us need to extend enormous self-compassion to ourselves, that we're going to say things and do things and be things that maybe don't go down well. And we're all going to come out the other side of this and have gentleness and compassion for each other again. Yeah. Wayne, I see your hand is up there.
I don't always like to ask questions so early, but I didn't see any other hands up, so I thought I would go ahead. Amber, there's been a lot of trivializing, even as Pepe said, in responses around the exercise, jogging and walking and that. In our household, it's not just a nice to have. In actual fact, it's one of the ways that we manage anxiety. When you're self-isolating, when there's a lot of people in the home, it's one way to, walk with a child or a spouse and process some stuff. And the one has been, and people that we're working with that are jogging specifically to manage mental health, really in terms of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, things like that. Yeah. So in actual fact, it's quite a huge one when it comes to mental health, because of also the endorphins that are released, et cetera, et cetera. So the one thing that we go to very quickly is the other forms of exercise. But I wanted to ask you more specifically from a psychological point of view, how does one manage now losing something that has been actually quite critical to mental health?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, in the same way that social connectedness is so critical to mental health. We've got the same in our family, where, everyone is most angst-filled around how that's going to work. There's a very interesting book called Habits of a Happy Brain. I don't know if any of you have read it, but in it, he talks about ways that you can simulate similar neurotransmitters through artificial means. So kind of, it's almost like hacking your system to be happy. And in it, he talks about the fact that stretching releases endorphins in a similar way to extreme exercise, or even, because endorphins only get released after a certain degree of exertion. I usually don't get there. But even micro stretching, so what I'm doing with my fingers just like now, it's a funny thing that you often see, and I see it in therapy, when people are feeling anxious, they'll start stretching, and it just allows that micro little spurt of endorphins to be released in the body. So if a small stretch does something like that, stuff like yoga and Pilates and that kind of stuff can go quite a long way. Someone just made the comment there of try jogging on the spot. I have heard of an Italian man who ran a marathon on a balcony. So I think if you can do that, we can find a way. But it's just going to require creativity. And maybe there can be a way to find alternatives. I've just seen another comment there. Can everyone see these comments?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I don't have to repeat them. But there's someone there. Leslie Sansom on YouTube is running on home clips. So Wayne, I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that it's going to be an important aspect to try and find a way to integrate, because it really helps our physiology so powerfully.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks, Amber.
Can I just add something here? Sorry, it's Vera. Maybe I should put on my video. Hi. Some of the things that I think we don't always think of are actually just normal parts of life that also give us some sort of exercise. So actually, for those of us who are not used to cleaning our houses, vacuuming is a very, very intense exercise. Sweeping is also quite an intense exercise. One of the things that I do regularly, where I've been surprised about how much I actually break into a sweat if I do it for a while, is eco bricks. So stuffing that bottle really well with a stick and putting the plastic in is a very good arm exercise, as well as you can literally, if you do it for long enough, you can break into a sweat. So there are some things that we can do that are very practical and that will also just help us give us a sense of control over our small environment.
Mm. No, thanks for that, Vera. I think we're all going to discover incredible lawn mowing muscles and dishwashing muscles. I'm really hoping to tell my children that the dishwashing muscles release phenomenal endorphins.
Amber, if I could ask, I don't know quite how to raise my hand here. Your defense mechanism number 3, fight, flight, and then what is your third one? And would you just say a bit more about it?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's called the fawning response. And obviously they're using that word fawning to try and fit in with the clever little Fs. But it's the response that tries to ingratiate. So people who tend to neglect their own self-care and often attend to the needs of others as a greater priority, behind that can often be the sense of, if I'm useful and if I'm needed, then I'm of value, because intrinsically in myself I have an anxiety that I'm not enough. So that fawning response it really does center around being useful, and that's why I think that it's going to be a difficult thing for people who engage in that anxiety defense. Being in isolation is going to strip a lot of the possibility for that defense being able to be accessed.
Emma, thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm kind of thinking about how these 4 or 5 Fs are reactions, and how there's like some kind of physiological thing that's happening when we have this anxiety. The 4 responses that you gave seem a little bit ad hoc to me, and so I'm wondering what's going on, kind of what the framework is behind that, and what is happening that is alleviating anxiety, or what a larger approach is to responding to anxiety, because it seems like the anxiety itself is probably some kind of misfiring response to what the environment actually is. I don't know.
Yeah. So the anxiety itself is the fact that on a very primitive level, when our nervous systems were still in the process of evolving, the primary thing we were wired for was to identify threat and to minimize it. And back in the day, that was absolutely appropriate. And that if the threat was a fire coming towards us, we either needed to fight to put it out or run away. And it's a deeply encoded response and very appropriate response. But as our society and our civilization has evolved, those responses are no longer as appropriate. We can't fight everything that comes our way, and we can't run away from everything that feels scary. And also, a lot of the threats that we interpret as being dire are actually not as extreme. So even with COVID-19, our actual threat of death is very minimal. The fear of the disruption, I think, is what people sit with. And the reason so it's a very primitive response, and it's encoded in our bodies. It's in our physiology more than anything else. It's really not even that psychological. It's a reaction, and that's why there's the physiological arousal that comes with it: sweating, the stomach empties. Often the blood goes, away from your stomach and into your hands and legs so that you can run. And the reason that they're not helpful is that by engaging in those defenses, we are telling ourselves that the threat is real. And actually, it's not real. It's a different kind of threat. It's not life endangering. Our brain has catastrophized it because that's what we've been hardwired to do. And so our healing from it is not to engage in the defense as if the threat was real. Our healing from it is to slow ourselves down and move away from the defense and not be recruited by it. And the way we do that is through the mindfulness and through almost coming to ourselves again instead of being reactionary. I don't know if that answers your question.
It sounds like well, particularly towards the end, what it sounds like is by slowing down our response, we're allowing like ourselves to process whatever it is better. So I guess that's why mindfulness or whatever would work. And it seems as though gratitude fits in the same category, where it's processing something in like a slower, more thought through kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, really, what we're wanting to do is to move away from the amygdala, which is the primal center of the brain and is the reactionary center, back to the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive functioning and can actually properly appraise threats, as opposed to just be recruited by this overwhelm of feeling.
Okay, this sounded. I mean, I'm familiar with like the reptilian, whatever kind of language, but I'm more familiar with the System 1, System 2 kind of Danny Kahneman.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, okay, thanks.
Sure.
Amber, we're just about on 7:30. I would still, before people sign off, want you to complete a brief poll. But Amber, thank you so much for doing this, and for. I know you're very busy, actually probably more busy right now, and it's wonderful for you to just basically have made this a part of your mission. You know, you sort of said, yes, let me do this. It's an important thing to do, and I think we all really appreciated what you that you made the time and the effort in a what's at the moment a very busy life for you. So thank you so much for doing that. You're a star. Thank you.
It's such a pleasure.